All right, there we go. Fantastic. So, just a little brief overview of how we're going to spend our time together. We've got about an hour and a half, and that time is going to fly. We're going to go through a lot of information. So, a little roadmap is we're going to start off with an intro to Partnerships for Parks. Who are we? What do we do? How does grants fit into all of that? Then we're going to get into a review of the program guidelines. This is the real meat of the conversation. This will be pulled largely from directly, really, from our guidelines, which some of you may have already read. But we're going to get into a little bit like the next layer deep and really explain what we mean when we say all of these things. Sometimes it can be a little bit jargony. We're going to make sure that everyone on this call has a clear understanding of what we're looking for and what we're asking for. And that leads us directly into the application walkthrough, which will be made up directly of screenshots from the actual application. So no guesswork required, no surprises. You'll leave this session knowing exactly what questions are going to be asked of you, and with lots of tips for the best way to approach those questions to give yourself the best chance at success for funding. And then lastly, we'll be at that Q&A section that I mentioned, where we'll get into all of your specific questions as well as we can. And so with that, I'm going to keep us moving right along and throw it over to Kuros for the intro to PFP.
Thanks, Zach. Yeah, before we get into the details of the grant, it's important we provide some context on our organization. So Partnerships for Parks, also known as PFP, is an organization made up of two parent organizations, City Parks Foundation, CPF, which is our nonprofit branch, and the Parks Department, which is our government agency. And our staff at PFP are made up of members from both parent organizations. Next slide, Zach. So a little bit about our grant. Here are some of the organizations and groups we funded in the past. As you can see, we reach all 5 boroughs, all kinds of organizations with a really diverse set of programming types. And they're all doing amazing things across the city with the grant funding. Next slide. So high-level overview on our resources and how PFP can support you. We have 5 main pillars. The first one is beautification. It's My Park. So these are volunteer events that take place all across the city in partnership with PFP. You can sign up for these volunteer events where you'll be painting benches, gardening, cleaning the parks, and you can coordinate with us to get the support you need. Our next pillar is trainings, which is our Partnerships Academy. So this is our public and free training program where you can sign up for training events. They're both in-person and virtual. And, we'll cover things like how to retain volunteers, organization building, funding opportunities. And we currently don't have any trainings right now, but they will soon be posted on our website. Next, we have staff support, community engagement. So every park in every district in all 5 boroughs has a CEC, which is a community engagement coordinator. And in the follow-up email, we'll send you a directory, which you can use to find out who your CEC is. And essentially, CECs provide support for fulfilling a project, knowing your resources, connecting you to the right people to make your programming a reality. Also, we offer community coaching through our Catalyst program. And this is a more in-depth coaching on community building. And this is really aimed for those neighborhoods that have less park groups, less community groups that are established. And lastly, the most obvious, our grants program, which is why you're all here. We offer grants to community groups in all 5 boroughs. Next slide, Zach. So this is an example of one of our CECs, Curtis. So as you can see, he works in specific community districts where he is supporting the parks there. He's a resource for these parks. If they have any questions, if they need to be connected to someone in the Parks Department, your CEC coordinator is a person to reach out to. Next slide. And that's it. I'll pass it back to Zach.
Thanks so much, Kuros. So as you all can see, lots and lots of opportunities to get involved and receive support from PFP. And I hope that regardless of how everything goes with your applications, whether you decide to apply or not, that you'll consider taking us up on some of these fantastic resources and opportunities. But to get into what we're all here to talk about, the Green Fund Grassroots program is intended to advance the viability of grassroots initiatives across parks and open spaces in all 5 boroughs and to foster a resilient network of equitable public green spaces. Now, this is sort of our vision and program description, but I always like to ground us here because this is what everything else flows from, right? There's a lot of information there, but I always like to focus on a few key terms. First and foremost, this is about the viability of grassroots initiatives. Everyone on this call, I know how much work you're putting in on a volunteer basis, most of you. You're spending your nights, your weekends, like putting everything you have into these projects, into your organizations to really provide a public service for people all across New York City. And that's not always easy, right? And so what we're here to do is to really connect you to the resources you need to make your dreams a reality, to make them viable, not just now, but in the long term, which gets to this next piece about resiliency, right? It's one thing to have a stable foundation to be able to handle things as they come today, but what about tomorrow, right? What about a setback? Or what about building beyond what we're doing right now, right? All of this is part of building a resilient network of public green spaces, right? To make sure that we're able to weather different storms and to meet the different needs of our communities, which then gets us into this question of equity. Equity is really important, a really important value at Partnerships for Parks. And we think about it in a couple of different ways, which we'll discuss later on in the application portion of this presentation. But primarily, I just want to ground us in the sense that New York City is an incredibly diverse place. We have lots of different cultures and lots of different peoples. And unfortunately, not all of these communities have been supported the same way as other communities, right? There are certain neighborhoods, certain parts of our city, certain people who haven't always received the type of support and care needed to really thrive and to prosper in the way that everyone else has. And so recognizing some of these historical challenges related to racism, environmental racism, redlining, gentrification, all these sorts of things, right, that we're all familiar with. Partnerships for Parks has made a real public commitment to supporting equity through our grant making and really thinking about where there are communities and people who need a little extra care to really like make up for a really long time of not receiving that. And so I always like to ground us in a couple of these values because I think everything else in this program flows from that. And again, we'll talk more about some of this as we get on in the presentation. But before we do that, just a quick note for any returning grantees. You might have received a grant in the past from the Green Relief and Recovery Fund, the Capacity Fund, or Green Arts Live. If that's the case, don't worry. You are in the right place now. The Green Fund Grassroots program is your all-in-one destination for grassroots funding from Partnerships for Parks and City Parks Foundation. All of those programs were combined last year and expanded into this program that we have now. And since it's still fairly new, we're only in our 3rd round since the big relaunch, I just always like to make sure that I flag that for folks. All right. And now here's when I tell everyone to pull out your journals, pull out your calendars, get your pens, whatever it is you do to keep track of dates, because these are all the important ones that you need to keep track of. First and foremost, our application is open now. That's what we're doing here, right? We're all talking about the application, but the deadline is coming up very quickly. Next Friday, August 16th at 11:59 p.m. That is when the application closes, right before midnight. So please, please, please make sure you are doing the work now so that you're not scrambling, Thursday, Friday night at 11 o'clock. It is coming up. Mark it in your calendar. We have this info session, and if you know anyone who wasn't able to make it today, we do have one more info session planned for Monday, next Monday at 6 p.m. So if you know anyone who wasn't able to make it, please tell them to register for that one. They'll at least have, that sort of full working week after the info session to prepare their application. And during this time, I am providing one-on-one consultations. I mentioned this earlier. A consultation, the way I always like to describe it is like if you ever had a teacher, maybe in high school or a professor in college who would allow you to turn in a first draft of a paper, it's just like that, but with your grant application. You can book 30 minutes with me and I will walk you through line by line everything that you've prepared, and I will review it and say, oh, this could maybe use a little tweaking, or this is unclear here, and we will work together to make sure that you have the best chance at success for funding. So I'm really happy to offer this service, and I can tell you, not nearly as many people as you'd think are taking us up on it. So there's still plenty of spots open on my calendar. Please book time with me. I would love to talk through your proposals. All right, so after the 16th, your work might be done, but ours is really just beginning. So what that will look like is we have a pre-screen process where we sort of just go through a quick review of every application that comes in. And it's really just to make sure, did you fill out everything? Are we missing any key information? And is this actually a right fit for our program? No one's submitting an application to get $10,000 for a brand new car, right? That's not what this is about, but you'd be surprised. So we got to do a quick screen of that. And then once that happens, we open things up to a large committee process. We get about 24 folks with diverse perspectives and backgrounds from all across Partnerships for Parks, City Parks Foundation, and other sort of allied organizations. And everyone comes together to collectively and democratically make decisions on every single application that's receiving funding. Now, this is a little bit different from how, if you're familiar with other grant programs, how those decisions are normally made. Normally, someone like me, who has a big fancy title or even fancier than mine, has like a portfolio and it's one person making all of these decisions. But we don't really think that's maybe the best way to do things. We prefer having this larger kind of democratic collective decision-making process. And I just flag that because it takes time. It takes time to do that thoughtfully. And so when you see this long process and you're wondering why it takes so long, it's because we're really putting in the effort to make sure that we're reviewing things from all angles. Now, once that's done, we sort of put together our docket, and that will go through final approvals from Partnerships for Parks and City Parks Foundation leadership, as well as our Green Fund donors, signing off on things saying, this looks great, send the money. Now, that brings us to what you all are interested in, which is when will you actually find out whether or not you've been awarded? And we are aiming for late October for grant agreement letters to go out to everyone who has been awarded. So you will receive notification in late October. You will get a grant agreement letter if you have been selected for funding. And then, that's a sort of legal document. We can talk more about that if you receive funding. The grant term will begin, and from that point of your notification, you will have 1 year typically to spend those funds. Some folks may be eligible for additional years of funding, and we'll talk about that later on. But for most folks, you're going to have 1 year from notification, so late October, a full calendar year to spend that money. And then the last thing I always like to say is something I'm really proud that we offer here is we offer every single person who submits an application and at least makes it to that committee step, right? If you get knocked out in pre-screen, you're missing information or anything like that, not relevant so much for those folks. But if you make it to the grant review committee, we offer declination feedback. This is much like a consultation, except it's after the fact, and it's a 15-minute call with me where I will walk through anything that you might be able to approve for next round, right? So we really do this because we respect the time and labor that goes into these applications. We know that it isn't easy and that you all are giving up time that you could be doing on other things. And so we don't ever want this to be a waste of your time. I just say that so that everyone is aware. We know how much effort you're putting into this, and we're happy to try and work together with you to make sure that should you not receive funding, which is a real possibility, right? That we're always working towards how we can improve for the future. And so what's the most important thing though? That deadline. None of that matters if you don't get your application in on time, which is again next Friday, August 16th at 11:59 p.m. So please, please, please get them in early. Don't wait until the last minute. All right. And then one final word before we get into the real meat of things. I hope that all of you shoot your shot. Sorry, I'm very punny and a little bit corny, so this will not be the first egregious pun in this presentation. But really, I hear this all the time that folks say, oh, this is my first grant application, or I wasn't really sure if this program was for me. I don't know if I can do this. If at any point in this process, whether this presentation or while you're filling out your application, you have that little voice saying you can't do this, this isn't for you, don't listen to it. Listen to me. You can do this, and this program is for you. Shoot your shot, and we're here to support you every step of the way. That's really important for me that you all know that. All right. But that aside, how do you actually know if this program is for you? How do you actually know if you can apply? Um, this is where things start to get more technical. So we put together this handy eligibility checklist in our guidelines, and we've more or less copied it over into these slides. So first and foremost, applications must be submitted by a member of a group or organization. Now, at PFP, we define a group as at least 2 or more people who are committed to carrying out a shared project. So if you've got 2 or more committed folks, congratulations, you're a group. Now, that does mean on the flip side, right? Applications submitted on behalf of individuals are not eligible. We're not here to fund any solo projects, no divas here. You got to be part of a group. So that's one thing to know. But applicants do not need a 501c3 in order to apply. You do not need to be an officially registered nonprofit. Now, if you don't have 501c3 status, you're going to either need to use a external fiscal sponsor, which you should know if you have one. That shouldn't be a surprise. Or you can select one-time fiscal sponsorship from CPF and Partnerships for Parks, and you do that directly within the application. I will point out exactly where it is in the application that you do that. But the big thing is that you don't need a 501c3 to apply. However, applications submitted by LLCs or 501c4s are not eligible for this program. I won't get super into that. It's just because of some different limitations and constrictions that we have on our end. So if you're an LLC or a 501c4, I'm sorry, this program is not for you. But we can talk more about that if you have questions. Next, applicants' annual operating budgets must be less than $175,000 for the most recently completed fiscal year. Okay, what does that mean? A lot of like accounting jargon there. So first of all, annual operating budget. For some of you, you're going to say, oh yeah, I know exactly what our operating budget was last year. That's great. That's why we word things this way. But for those of you who are like, I don't know what that is, I'm not sure if we even have an operating budget, that's okay too. You can think of this as your total expenses for last year. So when you get to this point in the application, if you're feeling a little bit lost, just think, how much money did my organization spend last year? And you're golden. That's what it is. And it just needs to be less than $175,000, and then you're eligible. And again, most recently completed fiscal year. So if you're a group that does operate in terms of fiscal years, you can just send us whatever you have from your most recent completed one. For anyone else, we just need a full 12 months. Cut it up however you need to. Most easy is probably just to look at 2023. But if you have questions, you can reach out to us and we can walk through it together. All right, a few more things. So if an applicant has received a grant from City Parks Foundation or Partnerships for Parks since 2020, all your interim and final reports must be submitted prior to applying for additional funding. I see some folks who received funding last year, 2023. There's a note for y'all. We're going to need your final reports by August 16th. So you should have the link to do that. The reason why we need it August 16th and not your normal date is because we don't want to be going into reviews and still be missing stuff from you. We want to know that you're already done. All right. So if you have questions about that and you're a grantee from last year, feel free to reach out to us. But for everyone, it's going to be important that your reports are all done and submitted prior to receiving additional funding. Now, also, applicants must possess demonstrated experience working in New York City's parks and open spaces and have a strong connection to the community or communities they are working in. This can be a little broad, but basically the gist here is that we don't want to fund people who are parachuting in, right? We want folks who have a real connection to the space they're working in. I always say for people to think about whatever it is that you're doing, why are you doing it here? What's the reason that you're doing it here? Like, how do you articulate how this program meets the needs of this community, why it needs to happen in this space particularly? That's really important for us. And as far as the demonstrated experience goes, that doesn't mean that you need to be someone who's like a super steward, parky, like born and raised in the parks. But if that's not you, it's great if that's you, but if not, that's okay too. So long as you have experience that's kind of directly relevant to whatever it is you want to do. So maybe you've done similar work to what you're proposing, but through the DOE with like public school kids or, other things like that. it's okay to speak to relevant experience. We just really want to make sure that what it is you're proposing, you actually have the skills and connections to carry that work out. That's really what this is about. And then lastly, your proposal must support work in one or more of the following public open spaces. Just going to quickly rattle these off: parks, playgrounds, green thumb community gardens, other community gardens that aren't green thumb, NYCHA properties, street trees, public plazas, open streets, waterfronts, and other. And yes, there are other. So if you think you're an other, go ahead. That's great. We love supporting parks and open spaces of all kinds. One quick thing that I will note, though, is that sometimes people are a little bit confused about what we mean by public. In this case, I do mean the very literal sense of the term. We're talking about publicly owned and accessible spaces, right? We often get requests about doing work on, like, let's say, church properties. While we recognize that, places of worship often feel very public, and may serve a sort of like role in the public life of a community, those aren't really public spaces in that way, right? They're privately owned and operated. And so I just want to shout that out because that can be a little bit confusing for folks. And we recognize that it may not fit with how people typically think of public in their neighborhoods, but it's an important distinction. All right. This was a lot of information, and eligibility is really important because if you're not eligible, you don't want to waste your time, right? So if you have questions about eligibility specifically, reach out to us via email, again, at greenfundgrassroots@cityparksfoundation.org, about this or really anything else in the presentation. We'll be happy to talk through it with you at any point. All right. Now here's what everyone's really excited about, which is the money. How much money can we get from this program? We've got a lot of info here, but I'm going to ask everyone to focus your attention on the left side of the screen first. We kind of split things up through this program into two broad tiers when we're looking at applications. First of all, groups with annual operating budgets, again, that's your expenses from last year. If that was less than $10,000, you may apply for up to $2,500 per year. So if your budget for the last year was less than $10,000, you're eligible for up to $2,500. There we go. Plain and simple. Now, if your budget was over $10,000, you can apply for funding up to 25% of your annual operating budget. So let's say your annual operating budget was $40,000, you could apply for up to $10,000. The reason we do this, right, is because we're serving such a wide variety of groups, right? Folks from all the way with operating budgets of zero, brand new, community groups, to groups whose budgets are, over $100,000. And so this was the best way that we were able to really make sure that this program is flexible enough to meet the needs of folks at all different parts of, stages of growth. So under 10,000, you can apply for up to 2,500. And if your budget was over 10,000, you just take 25% of whatever that number was, and that's what you're eligible to apply for. I know it's a little bit wonky, but I think we can all work with it. And if you have questions, I'm happy to talk about it. Now, you might have noticed that I was saying per year. So something that we offer is actually we offer 2-year funding support as well. Most folks are going to be eligible for just 1 year of funding, right? You'll get notified end of October, and you've got 1 calendar year to do all the work and to finish your program. But if you've received a grant from PFP or CPF since 2020, and yes, 2023 folks, that does now include you, you would be eligible for 2-year funding, again, so long as you've submitted all those interim and final reports. And we do this because it sometimes offers a little bit more forward planning for groups that we already have an established relationship with. Now, that doesn't mean you can just submit anything, right? Your application still has to be solid. And you have to have a plan, not just for that first year, but for 2 years, right? So there's a little bit extra work that goes into it. But this is an opportunity that we provide for folks who we've worked with a little bit more recently and who have done, completed their projects efficiently. A few additional things to consider if you're applying for 2-year funding. 2-year funding does not change your per year funding maximum. So what that means, right, is if you're going to submit your application and your budget last year was under $10,000, right, you'd be eligible to apply for $2,500. So in year 1, you could get 2,500, and in year 2 you could get 2,500. It doesn't mean year 1 you get 2,500 and next year sky's the limit. I want $10,000 year 2. That's not how it works. We kind of take a snapshot of your organization at the time of your application, and then that determines how much you can apply for per year, right? So it's essentially the same amount once and then again in your second year. That's how it works. And with that, when you're applying for 2-year funding, please make sure that your funding request is the same amount for both years, right? We're actually going to ask you, and I'll get to this in the application portion, we're going to ask you to break down what all you're going to spend your funding on to really give us a sense of your project budget. And you really want to make sure that year 1 and year 2 are equal, right? Because if not, then that's going to cause issues when we're reviewing your application. We'll get to that when we get to it. But just a few things to keep in mind. All right. This is the second corny pit stop on our way to the end of this presentation. We're going to check everybody's understanding. So I have a couple of quick math problems for you all that I'm going to ask you to give us the answer in the chat. First, if your organization has an annual operating budget of $10,000 or less, what is the max amount of funding that you can apply for per year? So your organization's budget is under $10,000. What's the max amount of funding you can apply for? 25, 25, 25. Fantastic. All right, superstars. Everyone's paying attention. That's great. Okay, next question. What if your organization has an annual operating budget of $20,000? What's the maximum amount that you can apply for then? $20,000. All right. I'm seeing $5,000, $5,000. Seeing 25%. That's great. Both answers are valid. I'm not here to make anyone do actual math on a Tuesday afternoon. So $5,000 or 25%, both totally correct and acceptable answers. And lastly, if your organization has an annual budget of $5,000 and you're eligible to apply for 2-year funding support, what's the maximum amount that you can apply for per year? So your budget was $5,000. You're eligible for 2 years. What's the maximum amount you can apply for per year? Awesome. Correct. Great job, everybody. Thanks for bearing with me. I know this might feel a little bit corny, but trust me, this trips up so many people. So now I know that there are at least like 20 people on this call who are going to have perfect, operating budgets and funding requests. So that's great. We've got 20 people covered. Great job, everyone, and thanks for sticking with me through this. All right, cool. So now we know how much money we can actually apply for, but what are we going to actually spend that money on? We've got a few different program areas that we support. Specifically, we have 6 distinct program areas. I am not going to go through this list here because I like the pictures better. So first of all, we've got stewardship. But what does stewardship really mean? Here at Partnerships for oh my gosh. Oh, that was crazy. Sorry, everybody. Leaned on my computer wrong. We define stewardship as community-led care of open spaces, such as volunteer service and beautification projects. Some examples of this might include planting a native flower garden, caring for a dog run, or organizing beach cleanups. All of these are stewardship. Whatever it is that you're actually getting your hands in the dirt and making a direct impact on your open space. Next is environmental action, which is all about educational and advocacy programs that provide community members with the knowledge and skills to take responsible actions to protect the environment. Examples would be hosting a teach-in on the impacts of shore erosion, maybe developing a proposal for your local community board in support of public composting, or even organizing an advocacy campaign against local sources of pollution. All of these things are environmental action. Next, we have organizational development, which are activities that support your organization's ability to activate public space So this is the only program area that isn't directly about work being done in public space, but more about taking your organization to the next level so that you can do more and more efficiently. So that could include anything from staff trainings to strategic planning, any communications work, financial management, fundraising, HR systems, or even transition or succession planning. I do also want to call out that grant recipients of this category may receive pro bono design support for website, brochure, or marketing materials from Partnerships for Parks. Incredible, fantastic art director, Anne LaFond. And you can see a couple of examples of work that she's done for our community partners here on your screen. She really is wonderful. And so if you are funding or budgeting for any of those types of materials in your application, we will be in touch with you about the possibility for design support. Next, we have youth development. This is one of my favorite pictures in the presentation. It's so cute. And I want to just quickly say youth development is a little bit different from how you might be thinking of it. It is not simply any program that involves children. Children are great. You should work with children and do things with children in your parks and open spaces. But when we say youth development, we're really thinking about programs that inspire children under the age of 18 and young adults 18 to 24 to pursue green jobs through hands-on service learning, paid work opportunities, and professional skills training. So this could mean a career day for local elementary school students, or maybe supporting young people through paid internships at your organization, or even developing a mentorship program with professionals in the environmental sector. All examples of youth development, really, again, about training up that next group of parks and open space leaders who are going to be the ones to replace us, because we're not going to be here forever, right? We've got to make sure that we're tending to and growing the next generation. Again, going back to that idea of resiliency, we got to make sure there are people following in our footsteps. This one's pretty straightforward. We support health and wellness programs, any activities that promote the physical, mental, and emotional health of people using New York City's parks and open spaces. So, active things that you see like here, like this boxing class, but also, yoga in the park or even weekly nature walks. These could be health and wellness programs. Then we have arts and culture, another sort of straightforward one. These are performing and visual arts and community-oriented cultural programs. So examples could be a celebration of traditional cultural dance, public theater performances, a movie night, arts and crafts making workshops, or even a music festival. Really, the sky's the limit in a place like New York City, right? Arts and culture, we live it, we breathe it. So, so many different opportunities there. And then lastly, this is not necessarily its own programming area, but I mentioned Con Edison before. This year, we have special funding provided by Con Edison that has been reserved for proposals focused on street trees, particularly in neighborhoods within environmental justice areas, though we're also excited to be supporting street tree work across the city, regardless of whether you're an environmental justice area or not. And I will talk about what an environmental justice area is in a little bit. But I say that this isn't a distinct programming area because there are all sorts of different ways that your work could connect to urban forestry work, street tree work. So examples might be fostering public engagement through educational or stewardship events, including anything involving City of Forest Day. It could be replacing lost trees or planting new trees in your neighborhood to help reach the goal of increasing our city tree canopy, or even conducting tree health assessments. Loretta, I see you with your hand. Unfortunately, we're gonna have to keep. Oh, I'm dropping out? Can I get a thumb? Are other folks experiencing me dropping out or cutting out? No? Okay. I'm going to keep on going. I see you, Loretta, with your hand, but we've got a lot of information to get through still. So I'm going to have to hold off on any question that you have until the end. But you can also go ahead and drop any question in the chat. But again, I just want to encourage everyone, if your group has even been considering, maybe expanding and getting involved with trees in your local community, want to highly recommend that you consider that further, because we do have, again, some special funding set aside this year for tree work specifically. All right. So those are our program areas, but within that, there are certain things that you actually can spend your funds on and things that you can't. That's what we're going to talk about quickly now. So again, focusing your attention on the left side of the screen. Eligible expenses, meaning what you can actually use this money for, would include a lot of basic things, right? Equipment, tools, plant material, general supplies. That first bullet point is going to be like 90% of what almost all of you are asking for funding for, right? The basic things that you need to carry out your projects. But also, you might be interested in hiring consultants, vendors, contractors, or other professionals, right? So maybe you're going to hire a musician to come and play some music at a party that you're hosting for, the opening of a new garden in your park. Or maybe you're going to ask someone to come in and teach yoga classes because that's not a skill that you have, right? Those would be contractors or professionals, right? That you're actually paying, through invoice or something like that. That's also totally acceptable. Now, additionally to that, if you're a group that is a 501c3, so you are a registered nonprofit, you can apply for support to pay for part-time or seasonal staffing costs. We just ask that, if that applies to you, a good rule of thumb is that really no more than half of your proposal should, in terms of the dollars you're requesting, should be for staffing support. Because ultimately this program really is about activating the community and public space. And so while we're happy to support staffing, that's a real need to be able to increase your organizational capacity. Again, a good rule of thumb is no more than 50% of your request should go to that. Um, on the flip side of that, in terms of people who you maybe aren't directly on payroll with you, any organization can use this funding to pay stipends of up to $600 per person. So the difference between sort of like someone who's on your payroll and someone who you're paying staffing with, paying a stipend to, is really that tax relationship, right? Anything beyond why we have that $600 cap is because anything beyond $600 requires you to fill out all these forms with the IRS and all this other sort of stuff that is just beyond anything that is going to be worth us being involved with, to be direct. But I think a really great example of how you could use stipends is, for example, maybe you have a bunch of local young people in your neighborhood, right, who are interested in potentially helping out with programs that you've got coming up. You could pay each person a small stipend to support you with that work. And that wouldn't apply to, they're not on your payroll necessarily. So that's an example of ways that you can use this funding. Additionally, marketing and outreach costs are totally good. And one-time event assurance. Any of these things are all eligible under this grant program. As far as what's ineligible, this should be pretty straightforward to most of you, but we still have to say it. Maintenance services conducted by anyone other than volunteers or interns. What that means is that you cannot pay someone to come and cut the grass for you. You can't pay someone to come in and plant the flowers for you. This is about volunteers, right? So that's a line that we have there. But also, we're not going to pay your rent or any other form of office overhead. That's something we're not going to do. We're not going to pay for any materials or for you to go out and electioneer and be promoting any specific political candidate. We're also not going to pay for any lobbying. So if you're going and meeting with folks trying to push a certain piece of legislation or anything like that, I'm not going to support that. And also litigation. If you get sued, don't call us. And definitely don't include that as your part of your grant proposal because we're not going to be able to fund it. So don't do that. Again, very straightforward, I think. But again, just have to make sure that we say it so that everyone's on the same page. All right. And I know we're getting close to the end of our time together as we move into this application walkthrough. So I'm going to keep things rolling, but just want to check in here to say thank you, everyone, for being attentive audience. We're nearly at the end and excited to get to all of your wonderful questions. So this is the application. Or more appropriately, this is the grants portal that you will use to actually access the application. This is the City Parks Foundation grant portal. And when you go to apply, you will see this little table of programs. And what you're looking for is the Grassroots Grant Program Fall 2024. Now, this is an old screenshot, so you're not going to see it here. but it will have a little blue piece of text that says start application. You just click on that, start application, and it will pull everything up and you're in. You're ready to go. Now, throughout this section of my presentation, I'm going to be using kind of red blocks and arrows to draw your attention to certain pieces. I don't have like a little laser pointer, so that's what we're going to do. In the top right-hand corner, you can see there's a little red box around English and Espanol. I want to just call out that whether you or someone you know speaks English, or if they're more comfortable working in Spanish, Partnerships for Parks is really proud to say that we offer everything that you need to apply for our program in both English and in Spanish. And so if you or someone you know is more comfortable working in Spanish, all they have to do is go to this page and then click Espanol, and every single thing will be translated automatically in the application, and they're more than welcome to submit in Spanish language. That's totally fine. The same goes for our guidelines, our FAQ, everything is available in Spanish. So just want to make sure that folks know that that is available to them. Now, our application is broken down into 3 pages, and the first is all about eligibility. I'm not actually going to go through all the eligibility questions because it's really just a reformatted version of what we talked about at the beginning of this presentation. It's just all of those statements are reformulated as yes or no questions. So very straightforward. But what I do want to call out is this Manage Collaborators button in the top right corner. So a lot of folks have asked us, hey, I'm working on this application, but there's someone else from my organization who wants to help out as well. Or, maybe you're going to be taking a vacation and they're going to take over for you. If you need someone else to help or want someone else to jump in and work on the application with you, that's totally cool. The way that you add them is using this button. So you will click Manage Collaborators and a little pop-up will come up and you will put in their email address and they will receive an invite to work on the application with you. It's as simple as that. One thing that you do need to know, though, is that there's a little quirk of the system. Collaborators are welcome to work on the application with you, but the system does not allow a collaborator to be the one to actually submit the application. I always say it's like my dad told me, and I guess for whatever reason, the Open Water Grants program subscribes to my dad's advice, which is that if you're the person who starts something, you have to be the one to finish it. That's just how it goes. We get emails every round of people who have these collaborators, and it's like 11:45 p.m. and they're like, we can't submit, and I don't know why. And then it turns out it's because it's a collaborator, not the person who actually started the application. So just keep that in mind and make sure that you are planning for that if you're bringing other folks along. And then that's really all I have to say about the first page. It's really straightforward. Oop. What is going on with my buttons today? Okay, application, the page 2. This is all general information, background about your organization, and kind of geographic information. So to start off, we're going to ask you to briefly summarize your organization's purpose and guiding vision. Now, that might sound really, really daunting, but it's really kind of like a thesis statement of like what it is you do and why you do it, right? Like very succinct, just straightforward. I'm going to say in general, use the character limit as your guide, right? You can see here that it says character count, 0 out of 500. We're only giving you, that's not words, that's characters. So don't agonize over something that we're only giving you 500 characters for. Like really don't overthink it, just put it down and move on. It's really okay. On the flip side, right, history with New York City open spaces, we give you double that amount. The reason why is because we need a lot more information there. We're asking you to summarize your history working in New York City's parks and open spaces. Obviously, you can't say absolutely everything that you've ever done. I'm sure many of you have been doing this for a very long time. But what I say to everyone is that this is your opportunity to brag, right? A grant application is not the time to be humble. You want to talk about the things that are the most exciting, most important, or impactful that you've really done in your organization as it relates to parks and open spaces. Additionally, if you have any relationships with folks who are actually responsible for maintaining the park or open space you work in, this is a great place to let us know that. It's not required, right? But if you do have a relationship with the maintenance and operations folks or some parks admin that you're constantly in communication with, or if you're a NYCHA property, if you know the director of that building or something, and they're on board with your project. This is a great place to let us know that. Again, not required, but it's certainly helpful for us to be like, oh, great, they've already been doing some work to get buy-in, right? That's really useful to know. So that's really the first couple of questions. And then we're going to ask some more in-depth questions about your organization, starting off with you describing your organization's leadership structure. Now, we recognize that grassroots groups, this is going to look very, very different for all sorts of folks. Some people will actually have like a board of directors and paid staff. That's totally cool. On the flip side, you might just have a couple of really active volunteers that get together a couple times a month and make decisions about what it is that you're doing. Whatever that looks like for you, we just want you to lay it out for us so that we have a clear understanding of who is making decisions and how decisions are being made. And the reason why we want to know that, one, is because it gives us a sense of your organization, but two, we ask a follow-up directly from that. Is the majority, at least 50%, of leadership in your organization, again, as you described in the question above, so however it is that you define leadership, are at least 50% of those folks people who are Black, Indigenous, or other people of color? BIPOC, if you are familiar with that sort of acronym. The reason why we ask this question, it's just a simple yes or no, is because this is one of the ways that we measure equity, like I talked about, right? We have a publicly stated commitment to support BIPOC-led organizations. And if we're not asking this question, there's no way for us to hold ourselves accountable to our own values and public statements, right? And that's not good for anyone. I do just want to quickly say that this is not an eligibility question, right? So if you answer no on this little box, that doesn't mean that you are ineligible or unwelcome to apply. But it is simply an important data point for us to collect. So if you answer yes, and at least 50% of your organization leadership are BIPOC, great. We're just going to ask you to briefly list the roles held by those folks. We do not need an exhaustive sort of like breakdown of all of their identities or like anything like that. Just want to know, okay, so-and-so is our vice president, so-and-so is our treasurer, whatever, whatever. Moving on. And if you answer no, you're going to have the same number of characters, 500 characters, and we're just going to ask what type of effort you're making to bring in people of color into your organization and into leadership. Because again, this is a very diverse city. It's okay if you don't have people of color in your leadership, but we want to make sure that everyone is thinking about how to make this work as inclusive as possible. And if that's something you've struggled with, it's okay to also tell us that you've struggled with that and things that you've tried that maybe haven't worked or how you're thinking about it. Again, if you just approach this authentically, everything will be fine. And again, it's not an eligibility question, but it's important for us to uphold our own equity standards. And we have one other way that we measure as well that we'll talk about a little bit later on. All right, moving on from that, something that's much more straightforward is your tax exempt status. Ooh, don't get too excited, everybody. Tax exempt status is very direct. You should know if you're a 501c3 or if you have an external fiscal sponsor, any of these sorts of things. So I'm not going to go through all of them, but I do want to call your attention to that last bubble. We are a volunteer group that would like to request one-time fiscal sponsorship from Partnerships for Parks through City Parks Foundation. If you are not a 501c3, if you do not have a fiscal sponsor already, that is what you choose to just elect into one-time fiscal sponsorship. Don't overthink it. It's like really that simple. And sometimes people get worried like, oh, is that a knock against me? It's totally not. Everything's good, but I just want to make sure you know where you actually go to select that option. After that's done, we're going to get into this stuff about the annual operating budget. Again, this is your expenses from the last completed year, if you want to think about it that way. We're going to ask you for a big round number, whatever that number was. Total up all those expenses and put it in that little box for us. Then no matter what it is you say, let's say you're like, our annual operating budget was $20,000. That's great. The next thing I'm going to ask you is to prove it to me. So when I say prove it to me, I mean you've got to upload some sort of a file that actually breaks down what those expenses were over the last 12 months or over the last year, or however it is you choose to break it up. We've got to be able to follow your math, basically. Now, this does not need to be anything super fancy. People can upload an Excel if that's what you're comfortable with, or you can even just upload a Word document where you just list things out, $100 on plants, $200 on tools, whatever, whatever. But we need that number in your budget confirmation to match up with the number that you put in the box directly before it. That's the most important thing. And again, this is all about your budget from last year, your organization's budget, your operating budget. All right. Then we get into some geographic stuff. We're going to ask you for the name of the park or open space you're working in. And then for whatever open space that is, everything else from this point on, you're going to answer according to that park or open space. Now, you may be thinking, a street address, how do I put down the address of a park? That's a great question. We understand parks don't have addresses. Just pick a location like directly adjacent to that park. This is really just for us to be able to map everything out. So don't stress too much about it. That's what we're looking for. Now, if you're someone who's planning to work in like multiple sites and locations, we get this question every year. That's totally fine. Think about, of those spaces you're planning to work in, like which one are you going to be spending the most time in, or where is like kind of your home base, and use that to determine your address and everything else. You can always let us know in your proposal overview, which we'll get to in a minute, but like, hey, we're doing this in so-and-so park and also in this other park and also this program in a community garden. And that's totally fine. But we need just one location for all of this geographic info so that we can map everything out. That's really what it comes down to. So after you give us that, we're going to ask you what type of open space this is, and you'll choose from the list there. It's the same one we went over before. We're going to ask you what borough it's in, what community district, what council district, all this stuff. And it's okay if you don't know that off the top of your head. Any time in this application that we're asking you for external information that is like beyond your organization's stuff, we're going to link you to exactly where you need to go to find that. So that's what all that blue text is: New York City Planning Community District Profiles, and so on and so forth. All you'll have to do is click that, and it's very straightforward to find out. You just put in the address. Now, that brings us to the last two kind of geographic, like general info questions. And these are a little bit more involved, I would say, to like actually get the answer to. But that's why we're going to walk you through them here. So first of all, we're going to ask you, is this open space located in a designated environmental justice area? And I'll talk again in just a second about what that means. And then next, we're going to ask about total acreage of open space served. I'm going to talk about what both of these questions are together, and then I will walk you through sequentially how you answer each of them. So, environmental justice area is a certain designation used by the city and also New York State to some extent, though they have kind of different terminology for these things. That's really about a classification of neighborhoods that typically have a higher percentage than normal of low income folks living there, as well as high diversity, high percentage of people of color, and a couple of other different sort of environmental factors. And they use all these different metrics to kind of determine whether or not a group is classified as an environmental justice area or not. And they're generally using census data for all of this sort of stuff. So that's what we're talking about. This is the other way, right, that we're measuring equity. It's both about who's in leadership in your organization, who's making decisions, but also about who is the community that's being served, right? So those are the sort of two ways that we're measuring equity. Now, acreage, again, going back to the fact that we are partially a New York City Parks program, Parks really cares about acreage. And so if you're working in an actual park or a New York City Parks operated playground or anything like that, we're going to need the acreage for that space. My appeal to all of you is to please, even if you're like 95% sure that you're not working in a New York City Parks operated space, please just humor me and go through the steps that I'm about to explain, because You might be, you might not, you might be wrong. And if you are, then it's going to save us a lot of work on the back end to actually like find this data for you later. Now, if you go through these steps and you realize, oh, there's no answer for you waiting at the end of this step, then that's okay. You just come back and you put in NA, that's it, and you're done. But again, you going through those steps really does save us a lot of work on the off chance that you might be wrong. So, because this really only applies to New York City parkland. But okay, we're going to take a step back to this environmental justice area question. How do you find out if your neighborhood or your park or open spaces is in an environmental justice area? Well, there's this handy dandy map. And this is a new map. It only came out actually a couple of months ago. It's, yeah, big fancy tool. There's a lot of stuff going on here. You can see all these different little check boxes. You can ignore all of that. All you need to do is look for this little magnifying glass in the top right-hand corner. You will click that. I've got it outlined here in red, and a pop-up will come up and you will put in your address, or the address of the open space, I should say. You'll click search and it will show you, it will zoom in and the area will either be highlighted blue or it will be in white. If it's blue, then that means your area is designated as a disadvantaged community. Now, this is the state terminology. The city recently adopted it. I did not pick this term. I don't particularly love disadvantaged community as a designation, but they didn't ask me. But that's what we're using. It is essentially the same thing as an environmental justice area. So if your space is highlighted blue, you will come back and you'll say, yes, designated as DAC. It's as simple as that. And if the space is highlighted white, then you come back, no, not designated as DAC. And there you go. That's all it is. You just look for blue or white, simple as that, and then you come back and you press the bubble. Done. Now, acreage, a little bit more complicated. Welcome to the New York City Parks website. If you've never been there, this is what it looks like. We're going to walk through an example here using Irving Square Park, which is my home park. Shout outs to Brooklyn. Shout outs to Bushwick. Love Irving Square Park. All right, we're going to go ahead and we're going to search. And you're going to get a page that looks sort of like this. If your space is an actual New York City Parks operated space. You can click on really either spot. You can click on it on the top left, or you can look under the little map. Either way, whether you click right or left, you will be brought to what is essentially like the park's homepage for that space. It's got like, depending on the space, it'll have more or less info about like the history. It might have some photos, like all sorts of interesting stuff. But what we're looking for is buried way, 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 way at the bottom of the page. So far that you have to scroll literally all the way to the bottom to where you can't see any other information. And we're going to look at the right-hand side of the screen, and there'll be a little like info bar. And you're going to look for the heading more about whatever your park is. So more about Irving Square Park. There will be a little thing that says acreage, 2.76. That's the number we're looking for. And then you just copy and paste it back from here into the application and you're done. Now, again, if this doesn't apply to you, all you have to do is go back and type in NA and then you're done. But again, this is really important information for us. So a little bit wonky, but that's how you get there. All right. I'm going to try and get through this next piece in about 10 minutes. So we're going to be moving pretty quickly here. Want to save as much time as possible for questions at the end. This is the last page of the application. This is really the heart and soul. This is what all of this is. This is what it is that you're actually applying for funding to do, right? This is your proposal. So it all starts with your proposal overview. And I always tell people, detail is important. Don't leave things up to our imagination. Don't leave things wishy-washy. And then maybe we might do this, or we'll do something like blah, blah, blah. That's not, we want to know that you actually have a plan and a vision in mind, and it's your job in this section to really paint that for us. So if you're ever lost, always just come back to the simple questions of who, what, where, when, and how. The who is obvious, the who is you. The what should also be pretty obvious, but again, if you're doing multiple locations, give this to us here. Where, when, and how. So again, these basic questions will really answer pretty much everything that we need to know. And that's like really what we want to see here is we just want to see a full vision of what it is that you want to do. And again, this should be what it is that you're actually requesting the funding for. Sometimes people kind of go above and beyond and they'll talk about this whole vision for their community and everything they want to see, which is lovely. But if it's not what you're actually requesting funding for, then it can actually confuse and kind of muddy your application. So try to be as focused as possible. Now, we'll have covered who, what, where, when, and how. There's obviously one more question, which is why. And that's actually the community engagement piece below. So we ask you to please describe the community that your organization intends to serve with this proposal, the needs being addressed, and how your organization is positioned to meet those needs. So the ideal relationship between these two questions is we should read about what it is that you want to do. And then based on the needs that you describe in your community, we should know exactly why you're doing it, right? It shouldn't be like, oh, the needs in our community are like kids don't have enough, resources, like after school programs are being cut and all this other stuff. And so what we're proposing is something that has nothing to do with that. What we're proposing is a farmer's market or something like that. A farmer's market is great. We love farmers markets. But what does that have to do with what you're observing in your actual neighborhood, right? Again, going back to that question of why is this program happening here? And maybe it's not your neighborhood, right? Maybe what you're thinking about is like you serve all of New York City, and the type of work that you do is something that not many people have access to. So tell us about that. But we really want to see a strong connection between these two boxes of connecting the needs that you're seeing to what you actually want to do. That's a really important piece. And then for whatever your project is, and the sky is the limit, we're going to ask you to come up with some goals and how you're going to measure them. Because it's not enough just to want to do something. I think it's always really important that we're holding ourselves to actually measuring whether or not we're successful, right? If I want to throw a series of movie nights and I get the projector and I get everything set up and then no one shows up, I'm probably not going to feel like that was a very successful movie night, right? So my goal can't just be to do the thing. I need to have some sort of number to understand, well, did I actually make the impact that I wanted to see? And so I've got a lot of this stuff here. These are really just different examples, and I won't go through all of them. These are all in the application, but I want to walk us through the first example. So the first example states that we aim to support 100 hours of volunteer stewardship work. All right, cool. We've got a number. We've got something that binary. We're either going to do it or we're not. We're either hitting or not. And we're going to do that through our bi-weekly park cleanups. Cool. We will attend local community board meetings to promote our work. So it's not just what we want to do, but how are we going to do it? I could say that I want 2,000 people at my movie night, but if I don't have a plan for actually how to get those folks there, then I could just make up any number I want, right? We want to see that you're actually thinking about how you're going to do it. And we're going to measure volunteer hours using sign-in and sign-out sheets at every event so that we can actually track and measure to know whether or not we're hitting those hours. And I want to just quickly say, whatever your goals are, that's great. You know your community, you know your space and your organization better than I ever could. I am not interested in telling you what your goals should be. I just want you to have goals. That's really what it comes down to. And we're never going to come back and be like, you said you wanted to hit 100 hours and you only got 85, and shame on you, wag the finger, right? But if certain things aren't working or you're not meeting certain goals, we want to be able to work with you to understand, okay, well, why do we think that was? Is there something we could do differently? It's always about building towards better, right? To understanding where things aren't working and how we can be more successful in the future. That is the purpose of this. And if we don't have clear goals, then we're not going to be able to do that down the line. So that's why this section really matters. Next, we're going to ask for a quick timeline. This is a huge box, but it's only 500 characters. And so that should tell you something, right? It's totally fine to do a bulleted list here. That's totally cool. All we're looking for is just kind of a brief outline of when you're going to do things. When is your program going to start? When is it going to end? If there are any really important milestones we should know about. So for example, if you're throwing a big, music festival, a really important milestone might be, well, I know that if I'm hosting the music festival in July, I need to have all of the acts booked by May. I need to make sure that's done. So it doesn't have to be exhaustive, but we want to see that you actually have a plan for how you're going to carry this out for a full year or 2 years, right? In some cases. And again, for 2-year folks, if you're just going to repeat the same thing, that's cool. Don't leave that to our imagination, though. Just tell us, we plan to repeat this project in the same way in the second year, right? It can be as simple as that, but we want to make sure that you have a plan for whatever the timeline and scope is of your project. So that it's not the end of it and you're like, oh no, I still have $500 to spend. What happened? That's not good. Then we're going to ask you for organizational partners. This is not every organization or every person that you've ever worked with. That's not what this box is for. What this box is for is any organization or individual who you know is more than likely going to be part of you executing this proposal, right? So the example I always give is like, say you want to plant a native flower garden in the park, but you're like not sure exactly where you're going to figure out the mulch situation or the compost situation, let's say, but you know that the local community garden, you've worked with them before and they've provided you compost in the past. Okay, that's awesome. That's a really great example of a local connection that you can call out here. That's the kind of thing that we're working for. Or maybe you partner with the local PTA in the past to help get the word out about your events because you work heavily with young people in your neighborhood. Those are the kinds of things we want to know in this section. And if none of that applies to you, it's okay to write NA too. Sometimes we're not as connected as we'd like to be, and you can write about kind of what you'd like to do. That's totally fine as well. All right. This is a lot of information here, but this is basically, some of this might look familiar. This is about your annual operating budget. And the reason why we have to ask this is really it's a couple of questions all to get us to this box at the bottom, which is your funding request, the amount of money you're actually requesting from the program. But to get there, we need to know, was your budget under $10,000 or over $10,000? Have you, some of these things are going to sound familiar, right? It's because all of these questions are determining the amount that you're eligible to apply for. So then once you get there, we're going to ask you to put whatever number it is, whatever the amount is that you're requesting per year, in that box. So that's what's going to go there. So let's say in this example, you had a budget less than $10,000. So you might put $2,500 there in that box. All right, cool, simple. But just like with your operating budget, the next thing is we're going to ask you to prove it. We're going to ask you to actually break everything down for us. So this, unlike your operating budget was looking in the past, your funding request is specific to this proposal and it's looking forward. So if you want $2,500, what are you going to use it for? And critically, we're going to ask that you only include expenses that will be paid for using your Green Fund Grassroots award. Sometimes people have these really big projects and proposals and they try to say like, this is everything that we're going to do this year. And then it's way above the number they put in that little box. And that's no good. That's going to be very confusing for the reviewers. They're going to be like, wait, where do we fit into all of this? So keep everything laser focused on your proposal and what you're actually asking for money to do. And to help you with that, we've actually put together a budget template that you can use. You don't have to use this, but hopefully it saves some of you some time. This is an example that you can also view directly from within the application, but the template looks just like this. And I'm not going to go through all of it, but I am going to call out some big categories. And I'll say that I put this together, all the formulas, everything adds up, so you don't have to mess with any of that. It'll automatically add and do all that stuff for you. You just have to put in the numbers. So first, in this sort of yellow section, we've got non-staffing expenses. So we break things out into non-staffing and staffing. So non-staffing, we've got shovels, we've got flowers, flyers, and we're going to pay a musician maybe for some kind of an event. And you can see that all adds up to this total non-staffing expenses. Very, very simple. I would also say about this level of detail is about what we're looking for, right? We don't need to know exactly how many hydrangeas and exactly how many tulips or whatever you want to purchase. You can kind of give us a broad category. Next, we're going to get into staffing and stipend expenses. And even those two things are slightly different, right? Staffing, you have to be 501c3. Stipends can be anyone. It's helpful for us to see how much you're spending on people that are regularly working with you. And so for this example, we've got 2 seasonal volunteer coordinators, and we're going to be paying them at $15 an hour. Straightforward, simple. What's the role? How many people? What's the rate of pay? We're going to add that up. And in this dark gray, we can see total projected expenses. That number is 2,500. It matches the green bar at the bottom, which is our total request from the New York City Green Fund. And if you've done everything right, that will match the little box from the page before that we showed it, that we were just talking about, right? Where you put in your request. But I do want to call out one thing. This is a little bit confusing. It's not going to apply to everyone, but some of you may have additional grant funding or other resources kind of already confirmed, right? Maybe you got a grant from Citizens Committee or you received some money from a local council member, right? And that's going to be money that you're actually going to use in this project. The reason why we might want to know that, I always give the example of, say your proposal is for a week-long music festival and you're only eligible for $2,500. If you put together a budget that's only $2,500 and it's just, oh, we're going to rent a table and some chairs and a sound system, I'm going to be like, wait, where are all the musicians and all this other stuff? How are you going to pay for that with just $2,500? Now, you don't need to break all of that down for us here, but it might be helpful for us to know that, well, I've got $10,000 that I already secured. And like, I'm going to use that for all these musicians to pay all their fees, right? And you would include that in this other applicable funding section, which is this next kind of yellow section there. Again, not going to apply for most of you, but we just want to call it out in case it does. And then at the bottom, you can see just peeking out year 2 funding request. So if you're applying for 2-year funding, you would need to do the first page for year 1 and the second page for year 2. And that's all it is. And it's exactly formatted the same way. All right. I know I'm a little bit over time here, so I'm going to move really quickly through the last of this. Funding need. Everyone needs money, but it's really helpful for us to know what impact this funding will have on your organization right now. Maybe you had a setback. Maybe you lost a funder. Maybe your shed in your garden was damaged, right? These are things that you didn't account for. Now you need funds to kind of make up the gap. Or also, maybe you're getting so many volunteers that you're actually overwhelmed and you need to expand capacity. It can be a positive need as well, but we want to understand the impact that this money is going to have on your organization. Again, similarly, not a time to be shy. Let us know what's going on. It actually is really helpful. And then lastly, we have a few optional pieces of supplemental material. You have 2 sections where you can upload a file, basically any file. It could be PDFs of old brochures or flyers that you've put together. It could be a video of some of your volunteers explaining how much they love working with your organization. It could really be anything and everything that you can imagine. And none of this is like going to hurt your application. It's not required. It's just for you to provide a little extra color if you're so inclined. We also give you room to add links to online material, maybe a YouTube video or any news articles about the work that you've done. And then lastly, if you're like me, you just love to write, you have a million things to say, you have a whole box of an additional 500 characters where you can tell us anything else that you want to tell us that you weren't able to in the rest of the application. So no matter how it is that you feel most comfortable expressing yourself, in the supplemental materials section, you have a way to do that. And with that, the end. We have finally an A, and I've seen that the chat is lighting up. And so I'm going to stop talking and for just a second so I can start hearing some questions, and then I'll be back to talking again. But thank you, everyone, for all of your attention. Really, really wonderful to have you all with us here today.
Zach, I'm going to jump in here with some questions. We got a ton to go through. So the first one is from Mika. She said, to be sure, fiscal sponsorship from PFP/CPF can be requested only once, right? So if we got it for a grant in the past, we cannot request it again.
So that's not entirely correct. I understand though exactly why you would think that. You can request it again. We just say one time because what we mean is when you're requesting that, it's kind of like you need to re-up each time. It's unlike maybe other fiscal sponsors where you enter into a contractual agreement and then that applies for several years at a time, right? That's how a lot of these groups work. But for us and one-time fiscal sponsorship, it basically means like, we're going to cover this grant, this specific thing. And then next time, if you want to use it again, you just need to let us know again. So that's what that means.
Great. Molly asked for the Con Edison street tree funding. Is it possible to extend the funding as well? And I'm assuming she is referencing to a 2-year grant, rather than a 1-year grant.
Yeah, so there's no additional steps or anything that you need to do if you're interested in doing tree work. So if you're eligible for 2-year funding, you still need to meet all the requirements that we laid out. So you have to have received a grant from us since 2020, and you have to have all of your reports done. But if that's the case, you're welcome to, talk about build a proposal for tree work and apply for 2-year funding. It's not a guarantee that your proposal shakes out and that you're actually funded, but there's nothing additional that you have to do. That money can go towards 2-year funding. Absolutely.
Great. And while we're on Con Edison, Loretta asked if the Con Edison can fund bushes. And I'm assuming, Loretta, maybe you want to clarify in the comments, but bushes located in, a street tree spot.
I would say that if it's anything related to the street tree bed, so there's always that like space around the tree, that could potentially work. Now we have to be really careful with planting around trees though, because anything super close to the tree is, I learned this recently through a parks training, is the critical root zone. And so we actually have to be quite careful when we're planting anything that close to trees. So if that's what you're talking about, it's possible that we could support plantings in tree beds, but it would depend on what you're planting and how close and where. But on the flip side, if you're talking about like just a bush, like not related to trees at all, like not in a tree bed and like not connected to a tree in any way, that would not be eligible for funding. So hopefully between those two answers, we covered the options.
Great. And a few people asked, how do you measure the acreage if your application is primarily for street trees?
If you're primarily for street trees, don't worry about acreage. It is technically like parks managed, but there's no actual way to like really measure that unless you got out there with a measuring stick, and we're not going to ask you to do that.
Great. So Natalia asked, if you were directly adjacent to an environmental justice area and you work in that area, but your primary location is not in it, is it still valid to indicate EJA?
That's a little bit of a complicated question. I would probably need to see exactly what you're talking about to be sure, but based on what you've said, you said that like you do a lot of work in the environmental justice area. I think, we would use the honor system. Like you've just got to be authentic and honest with yourself. Like, is the bulk of the work in this proposal happening in that environmental justice area? And if that's the case, then you should mark it, and you could use that space as the one that you put kind of at the top billing and do all the geographic info for that space. If it's not the primary location that you're working in, then even though you're close, it really is like a binary thing, and I would need to ask you to not select it. But again, this is not an eligibility question. So don't fret over that. But yeah, it's a little bit complicated. I know whenever we're drawing like these hard boundaries, hard borders always cause problems, right? Pretty much everything. So I know that's a little bit complicated, but that would be my answer to that. Sorry, I can't be a little bit more specific without seeing everything.
Natalia also asked, can professional contract fees be more than $600?
Yes, great question. So any payments to consultants or vendors or contractors, that can be as much as they need to be, because that's like a payment to a business, right? It's not, even though we look at it differently as kind of like a different category of expense, it's really not any different from like I'm going to Home Depot or whatever and buying like $1,000 in tools and lumber and stuff. You're paying someone. You're paying someone who has some sort of a business or whatever. And so it's really not any different. Like a yoga instructor is functionally the same as like a bunch of flowers in that way.
Great. Last question from Natalia. What if we are relying on other funds that we haven't secured yet? Would that be acceptable to go into our budget sheet?
No, it's not. We need to know confirmed funding because here's why, right? We all hope that we get everything that we apply for. The reality is that is almost never the case. And so what we don't want happening is that you budget for all these big ideas and all these plans that you have, and then we put in funding to that, and then some of it falls through, and then suddenly it's like, oh, this vision that you presented that the whole review committee like considered and thought, oh, this is a great idea. Now it's half of that. Well, we can't go back in time and reevaluate your proposal against everyone else's based on this like reduced version of it, right? And so we really only are gonna we're really only interested in funding that has already been confirmed. And so that's the main thing. And with that, again, we really want to make sure that it's clear in your application what it is that we are specifically funding. So we don't want you to like, you can let us know we've got these other grants that we have confirmed, again, not projected, but confirmed. But in terms of the actual cost breakdown in your funding request, try to really only keep that to what it is that we would be paying for. So, that's what I would say. And I'll flag for like some of these things it can be a little bit complicated and you'll be like, oh, this feels a little bit wonky. I've seen people use that box at the end where it's like, is there anything else you want to say? Sometimes people use that to explain pieces of their application where it's like, oh, hey, this might look a little bit weird, but here, this is because XYZ or whatever. So that's something that you can do, but I know that I gave kind of like multiple answers to questions that you didn't ask, but that's generally what I would say.
Hagar Espinal asked, are public higher education institutions like CUNY campuses eligible? I work at Brooklyn College and our office manages a community garden on campus. We also have a 501(c)(3) foundation.
That's a great question. I think yes. I think that would be. It would depend on like how accessible the garden is and like what hours are. I think we with things like that that are kind of like in a gray zone, we try to really think about like, is this more or less as accessible as like a green thumb garden? I don't know, and that varies depending by garden, but um I would say I think that's good. If you maybe want to follow up with us by email, and let us know a little bit more, we could maybe respond a little bit more directly, but I think you would be fine. I want to give an example of something that wouldn't work though. Like we've had people who, on the tops of elementary schools, sometimes there are like little gardens that are like essentially community gardens that like students and teachers run, but that's not really publicly accessible, right? It's like on school grounds, but like most people can't like get up to the, roof of an elementary school. So I imagine it would be different because you're a college campus, but I'm just kind of trying to give some different examples of what would and wouldn't work.
Great.
I don't know if one of my other colleagues maybe has different thoughts on that, but I think it would be fine.
Another question is, do you need to see bank statements?
We don't need to see bank statements as part of your application, but we do need, right? We need to see a breakdown of what your operating budget was for the last year. So a bank statement's probably not going to be the best way to present that information. What would be most helpful is if you looked at your bank statements and pulled out all those expenses and then put that into like an Excel document for us or a Word doc that's like a list and then totaled it up for us. But a bank statement by itself is not something that we're asking for, and honestly not something that would be super helpful. But yeah, I understand where the question's coming from though.
Great. We got one from Annette. So she is asking a question in regards on how to denote the location of her project. So they say tricky for us reading multiple locations because our permanent parks home is in a well-heeled area, but the work we are heavily focusing on and seeking funding for is for our program of years in an underserved area with sorely lacking water access and deep systemic inequity. Also, we would like to travel with our program to bring it to communities who typically have far less access to kayaking or similar water sports. So how would they denote that location?
Yeah, great question, Annette. I want to just acknowledge we're at 1:31. I'm happy to stay on for a few minutes. I know that we had kind of like a little tech issue in the past and earlier, but I just want to flag that for everyone. I'll stay on for a few more minutes and continue answering questions, and that'll be part of the recording. Um, Annette, there are a couple of things in your question. So from what it sounds like the actual proposal that you would be requesting funding for is in this more like under-resourced area. So in that case, you would use that park or open space as the location, right? Because that's where it doesn't matter, I'm making this up, but it doesn't matter that your office is in, let's say, like in Times Square. If like where you're actually doing the work is somewhere else. Now, we would probably want to know like, oh, like what's your connection to this community or things like that. That would probably be important for us to know, and like your history of parks and open space work. But if where you're actually going to be doing the work is in this community, then you should use that as like for all the geographic information. Now, what I want to say about like doing work in multiple sites or like even multiple programs, we encourage that. It's great. We want you to be able, especially if you're, someone who's able to request, $10, $15,000, right? We recognize like you can do a lot with that amount of money. But what I want to like just caution everyone about is like the size of that box for your proposal overview does not increase along with your funding request. So just because you're applying for $15,000 worth of funding, you still have the same 1,500 characters that everyone else does. And the reason I say that is because with each piece that you add on to your proposal, right, we're not going to look at it and say, well, if you list 10 ideas, we're not going to say, well, idea 3, 6, and 9 all sound great. We're going to fund those. That's not really how we operate. We're going to look at everything together. And so if you've got like some ideas that are really fleshed out and other ones that are really confusing or like a little bare bones, that's going to weaken your overall application. That doesn't mean you shouldn't think about multiple projects or multiple things, but you want to make sure that you're giving yourself enough space that you can very clearly articulate the vision for each part of your proposal. And for everything that you mention in your proposal overview, right? Like that needs to connect through your funding request, that needs to connect to everything else. And so the general advice here is like go for it, but don't bite off more than you can chew. Make sure that you're able to actually like explain in detail what it is that you're doing with each part of these projects and each different site, right? So that's like a yes, go for it, but really think about and strategize how you're going to talk about it in the application.
We have one more question from Hager Espinal. I answered it, but I think it would be great for you to talk about it. The operating budget for the garden is separate from the colleges. So we submit the operating budget of the garden, correct?
That is correct, Stalin. And I would also say that we get a question quite often of like, oh, we have a fiscal sponsor. Do we use the fiscal sponsor's budget? No, you do not. Fiscal sponsors typically have budgets of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. That is not what we're interested in. We're interested in your budget. So directly to Stalin, you would use the operating budget for the garden. For anyone else who you might be wondering, like, oh, I have a fiscal sponsor, same thing applies. We're looking for your budget, not the fiscal sponsor, not anything else. And then I see a question from Meka as well. If we already got a grant from PFP in the past, is there any reason not to apply for a 2-year grant and apply for a 1-year grant instead? I think this is a really good question, and the answer is going to depend wildly depending on your group, right? This really comes down to like internal group capacity and like what your vision is for a 2-year work, right? Like, I'm not trying to like avoid the question, but it's really one of those things that without knowing the specific circumstances of like exactly what it is you want to do, that's like hard to answer because I mean, the simple answer would be like, no, absolutely not. You should just go for 2-year funding because like that allows you to plan and like think about it. But at the same time, if you're like, if it's really clear that like in going through their application, it's like, oh, I don't know if they know what they want to do in year 2. Or, if you're looking at your organization, like maybe you're going to have like turnover of leadership or something. And, there are all sorts of reasons why individual organizations might look at that and be like, well, actually, I don't know if like we're ready to like manage 2 years worth of money. Like I don't know if we're set up for that, or you know, our leadership is going to turn over, and I don't want to lock people into a program that they haven't had the opportunity to like weigh in on. You know, there could be all sorts of like internal reasons why you might not. Um, but without knowing the context of your individual organization, I can't really say one way or the other. But there's no like mechanical thing. I don't know if that's maybe the right word, but there's like no like specific downside, I guess, to it. It's really just your organization and whether or not it's the right fit for you at this time. It's an option on the table, not a thing that you have to take. Really great question though. Um, all right, I think we're at 1:37, so we're almost 10 minutes over. Great. Plan on continuing the work for at least another 2 years. That's always great. We love to hear that. Um, with that, everybody, I'll give it just a couple more seconds if anyone has any burning last minute questions. You can also always email us again at greenfundgrassroots@cityparksfoundation.org. You will be getting this recording, the slides, and everything in a follow-up email in the next day or two. Yeah, and thank you so much. You're a really great group of folks to spend the afternoon with, and wish you all the best on your applications. And please, please, please consider taking me up on a consultation. I cannot tell you how much it really helps people, even if you're confident. Trust me, there's always something that can be tweaked, always something that can be improved, even in the best applications. So I highly, highly encourage it. And with that, thank you so much, everybody. And thank you to the folks from the PFP team who are here as well. Lovely seeing you all as well. So thanks, everybody, and have a great rest of your day. Excited to read all your proposals. Take care.